Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz here to talk to you about Carl Schuricht and his EMI recordings. There are actually some other Schuricht boxes, one on Decca and a couple that were issued by Hensler or SWR. And I might want to talk about some of those later at some point. We'll see. But this is the set that you have to have for a couple of reasons. It only contains two composers, Bruckner and Beethoven, the third, eighth, and ninth symphonies with the Vienna Philharmonic, and a Beethoven cycle with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. First, let's talk about the Bruckner. Schuricht was a terrific Bruckner conductor. The performance of the third is one of normal tempos, beautifully played, wonderfully balanced, completely natural. Schuricht was one of those conductors who didn't have, you might say, a overtly personal style. He just sort of lost himself in the music, and it unfolds at his best in any case. He was a guy that some people like to refer to as Kapellmeister-ish. That means kind of work a day, your average musician, and maybe in some respects he was. But I think he had a really keen, probing intellect, and he thought about everything that he did. For example, the Bruckner Ninth is one of the great ones. He gets through the whole piece in 56 minutes. The Adagio is only 20 minutes, but my goodness, what fluidity and expressivity he brings to the music. It's really remarkable, and it sounds like no other performance. Believe me there. In the eighth, he makes a tiny little cut in the finale, which is otherwise the Novak version. But it's also an exciting performance, just vital and alive, and the Vienna Philharmonic plays well for him. I mean, they're really lovely performances, and they've sort of been flying under the radar. Bruckner people know about them, but the rest of humanity kind of ignored them because they never got much attention from the record label. But you should really hear the ninth, and the third, I think, is quite wonderful too. It is, by the way, the third version, the 1889 revision published in 1890. So that's the one you're going to hear. And as I've mentioned in the previous talk I gave on the Bruckner third, Bruckner and myself prefer the 1877, but that's okay. It really is, because they're both beautiful and it's a great work no matter what, and that's all right. Now we come to the serious stuff, the Beethoven cycle. This is an important historical cycle for reasons that have implications beyond the excellence of the performances, and they are excellent. First of all, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, as I mentioned in my talk on vibrato and Beethoven, was founded by Francois Habeneck, the conductor, in 1828, specifically to play Beethoven. It started with Beethoven, it played Beethoven, it had the monopoly on Beethoven. One of the greatest sort of myths that people have started to buy into, propagated by the period instrument people, the hipsters, is that they somehow have some line of authenticity on Beethoven. That is such bullshit. The authentic tradition of Beethoven performance is ours. It's what orchestras do now. The modern symphony orchestra was created to play Beethoven. It was created in response to the demands that Beethoven made, and instruments were improved so that they could play Beethoven better than in Beethoven's own day. There is no reason whatsoever to think that anything one of these period instrument persons does is in any way more authentic in terms of the performance of Beethoven and the tradition of performance of Beethoven than what you'd hear your local symphony orchestra doing on any given day. And that's a fact. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And it becomes more evident if you look at the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, which has the provenance. That was the ensemble that had an absolutely unbroken tradition of Beethoven performance originating in the same place and the same institution since Beethoven's own lifetime. Habeneck knew Beethoven. He wanted to play Beethoven. And it's very interesting to note the biggest difference between orchestras then and now, the period instrument people would want us to believe, isn't just the nature of the instruments, but also the size of the orchestra. Well, Habeneck's orchestra, which was the best orchestra in Europe, and why should we hear Beethoven played by anything less than the best orchestra in Europe at any time, ever, now, then, or in the future? His orchestra had 60 strings. They were arranged 15 first violins, 14 second violins, 10 violas, 12 cellos, and 9 basses. I think that's what it was. And even later, it was based on the Paris Opera Orchestra, where the forces were 12, 12, 10, 12, 8. They always had large string sections. You will not find a single period instrument group out there recording Beethoven regularly with anything like that size ensemble. But that's the size that should be playing Beethoven. And they had, of course, the normal complement of winds and brass as required by the individual work, along with timpani and percussion. So, by the late 1950s, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, which had, we think, oh God, it's 1950s, this was the 1820s. That's not as long as you think it is, folks. I mean, you're talking about the lifetime of 3 or 4 generations of musicians, most likely. I mean, a performer who entered the Paris Conservatory Orchestra in the 1830s, let's say, when that tradition was very much alive, and who lived into his 60s or 70s, would have brought you almost to the turn of the century. And that person would have trained another generation of musicians who would be in the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, who well could have been there in the 1950s. It's not inconceivable. In fact, we know that this is what happened. We know it. We can show the provenance of some of these musicians. So it's not as if there was this long lost, we have no idea what was going on thing. That's not true. There was a tradition. Yes, the instruments improved. Yes, certain traditions of performance as regards the relationship between conductor and the musicians and things may have changed. But what matters much, much more than whether the instruments were built at a time or whatever is how they were played. And in the Paris Conservatory, they had a consistent tradition of how they were played. And that is what matters. We can't, of course, prove any of this. But who are you going to believe? That the people who have the actual playing tradition going back till God knows when, or doing Beethoven the way Beethoven ought to be done, or some collection of kids from a conservatory who read a couple violin treatises and founded a pickup ensemble have a more authentic way of playing Beethoven. So, that being what it is, unfortunately, I'm getting a date here, never mind. Unfortunately, the Paris Conservatory Beethoven cycle was only recorded in mono, although the ninth was done in stereo, and the stereo version of it has been issued by Testament separately. But the basic recording is in mono, and it sounds fine. It's perfectly good, perfectly listenable mono. These performances are excellent in every way. Schuricht was a terrific Beethoven conductor. Again, he's not the flashiest. He doesn't impose a overwhelmingly distinctive vision on the music. But in a sense, that's okay, because what we want to hear is this great orchestra doing its best in music it knows better in its corporate memory than probably anybody alive at the time. And he's particularly memorable in the Eroica, which is just one of those lithe, lean, it's a wonderful performance. In the Pastoral, where you hear those wonderful French woodwinds and the beautiful lean strings and these airy, transparent textures. And of course, the ninth is exciting because it's the ninth, and it's actually well sung and very well played. I just think that anybody who cares about Beethoven and the real tradition of Beethoven has to have the Schuricht Beethoven cycle. And it's, of course, to Schuricht's credit that he gets them to play so well, that the music is always fresh and alive and vivid and sounds like no other Beethoven cycle. It sounds like the Paris Conservatory's Beethoven. They had the identity in that music. And so I really think that if you want to hear a kind of Beethoven that really doesn't exist today anymore. We're part of a different tradition of Beethoven, which is the German tradition of Beethoven playing. That's how we modeled ourselves on the German orchestras. But the German orchestras only existed later. They post-date Beethoven for the most part. I know people will say, oh, well, the Gewandhaus, it's been around since 1402 or something. That's bull also, by the way. The first major orchestras, as we understand them, modern orchestras, first there was Paris, and then as we commonly think that as having an ongoing series with consistent players doing the usual thing, that was the Vienna Philharmonic and the New York Philharmonic, and they both date from about 1842. That's when they got started. And it was the German idea of Beethoven performance, which they co-opted. They took over from the French when they started doing it, and they realized what their historical patrimony was, and they started to get the kind of funding and community support to have civic orchestras that were regularly constituted and performing. Then, of course, they had their own style of Beethoven, which is a whole different story, maybe. And maybe we have two equally authentic competing traditions in Beethoven. But the fact of the matter is, we are not so far away from the death of Beethoven because that we can't enjoy what there is of the actual, true, authentic tradition of Beethoven performance. And the performances that show it more than any others are Carl Schuricht's, and they're in this box, which you can get inexpensively on Warner, and you really owe it to yourself to own it and listen to it and cherish it and savor it and keep on listening. Thank you.